Abigail Turner tore the veil off her head and threw it into the dirt. Her hands were shaking. Her sister's wedding dress, the one Clara had been sewn into just 3 hours ago, hung off Abigail's shoulders like something borrowed from a ghost. The hem dragged in the dust. The buttons at the back wouldn't close all the way. And the man who had paid every last dollar for a bride named Clara Turner was standing at the end of a dirt road in Wyoming waiting. Abigail picked up her carpetbag, and she walked toward him anyway. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you this one will stay with you. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning Abigail Turner became a bride who was never meant to be one started the same way most disasters do, quiet then, all at once. She had been awake since before the sun came up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a list of things that needed doing before Clara's stagecoach left at noon. There were preserves to label a hem, to finish a letter to be written to Wyatt Callahan's ranch hand confirming the arrival date. Abigail had done all of it. She was good at doing things that needed doing. She had been doing them her whole life. Clara was the beautiful one. Clara was the one with the laugh that filled a room and the kind of face that made men forget what they had been about to say. And Clara, at 22 years old, had somehow managed to secure a marriage agreement with a Wyoming rancher named Wyatt Callahan, a man who had sent a bank draft for $240, a signed letter of intent, and a photograph of himself standing in front of a fence line that seemed to go on forever. Abigail was 29. She had a scar above her left eyebrow from falling out of a barn loft at age 11, and she kept her dark hair pinned back so tight it sometimes gave her headaches. She was not the one anyone sent bank drafts for. She had accepted that a long time ago. Abby. Her mother's voice came from the back of the house, thin and wavering. Abby, come here. Come here right now. The tone of it made Abigail set down her coffee. She found her mother standing in the doorway of Clara's room, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, like she needed it to hold her up. Inside the room was empty. The window was open. The curtain moved in the dry Kansas wind. And on the bed, laid out like a burial cloth, was Clara's wedding dress. The ivory one they had spent 3 months stitching by lamplight, and beside it a folded piece of paper. Abigail picked up the note before her mother could. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I don't love him, and I won't lie to a man's face and call it a marriage. Don't look for me. I'll write when I'm settled. Tell Mama I'm sorry. Tell Abby I love her. Her mother made a sound. Abigail had never heard come out of another human being. It was the sound of something breaking that couldn't be fixed. Abigail folded the note back along its crease. She set it on the bed. She looked at the dress. What do we do? Her mother whispered. And that was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when a man has paid $240 in good faith when a contract has been signed? When a letter of intent sits in a drawer with a photograph of a fence line that goes on forever, and the woman who agreed to all of it has climbed out a window and vanished into Kansas before sunrise. You either write a letter explaining what happened and return the money that no longer existed because it had paid the back taxes on the farm and the new roof and her father's doctor bills, or you do something else. Abigail looked at the dress for a long time. I'll go, she said. Her mother turned. What? I'll go to Wyoming. Abigail said it again, slower, the way you say a thing when you're still deciding whether you mean it. I'll go to Cheyenne, and I'll tell him the truth. I'll tell him Clara didn't come, and I'll offer him, I don't know. I'll offer him the money back in installments or work, or whatever a decent man would accept as fair settlement. But somebody has to go. Somebody has to stand in front of that man and not make him look like a fool who got robbed. Abigail, you can't. Mama. She said it quietly. We took his money. Clara took his money and ran. We can't just send a telegram and disappear. That's not who we are. Her mother was crying now silently, the way women who had lived hard lives cried without making any performance of it. He's a stranger. You don't know what kind of man he is. He wrote 4 letters, Abigail said. Long letters. I read them. A man who writes like that isn't someone to be afraid of. She paused. And if I'm wrong, I'll figure it out when I get there. The stagecoach left at noon. By 10 o'clock, Abigail was sewn into her sister's dress. It didn't fit her the way it had fit Clara. Clara was narrower through the shoulders and softer everywhere else. On Abigail, the bodice pulled, and the seam strained, and the hem dragged a full 2 inches on the ground, because Abigail was taller and had always known it as a small private embarrassment. Her mother did what she could with extra pins and a length of ribbon, and when it was done, they stood in front of the small mirror in the bedroom and looked at the result. "You look like a bride," her mother said. "I look like someone wearing someone else's wedding dress," Abigail said. "Same thing sometimes." She carried one carpet bag. She had packed what she thought she might need for a journey of 4 days, and whatever came after 2 plain dresses. Her good boots, the small leather ledger she always kept with her because she had worked accounts at the hardware store for 6 years, and the habit of organization was the only luxury she allowed herself. She packed her father's folding knife, the one he had pressed into her hand 2 winters ago, before the fever took the last of his strength. And she packed the photograph, the one Wyatt Callahan had sent of himself standing in front of that fence. She looked at it once more before she tucked it into the ledger. He was a lean man, dark eyes, a hat tilted low enough that you couldn't read his expression. He stood with his arms loose at his sides and his boots planted like he was part of the ground he was standing on. He did not look like a man who smiled easily. Abigail tucked the photograph away. The stagecoach station smelled like horses and axle grease, and the particular kind of human desperation that collected in places where people were always leaving somewhere and not yet arrived anywhere else. There were 6 passengers boarding, a traveling merchant with 3 trunks, a young couple who kept whispering to each other and looking at their hands, an older woman in a gray dress who sat down across from Abigail and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, and then said, "Wyoming." "Wyoming," Abigail said. "First time out west?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman nodded like she had expected that answer. "I'm Helen Marsh. I'm going to Laramie. My sister's husband died and she's got 4 children and a homestead claim and nobody else." She folded her hands in her lap. "What's yours?" Abigail hesitated for only a second. "I'm going to meet a rancher named Wyatt Callahan," she said. "I'm going to tell him the truth about something, and then I'm going to offer him whatever fair settlement he'll accept." Helen Marsh looked at her for a moment, at the dress, at the carpet bag, at the way Abigail was sitting straight-backed and still like a woman holding herself together through the sheer force of deciding to. "That's a brave thing," Helen said. "It's the only right thing," Abigail said. "Those aren't always the same." "No," Abigail agreed. "But this time they are." The 4 days across Kansas and into Wyoming territory were not kind. The heat was relentless, the kind that pressed down on you from above and rose up from the packed earth below and met somewhere in the middle of your chest and made breathing feel like a small act of stubbornness. The dress was wrong for it, the fabric too heavy, the collar too high. By the end of the 2nd day, Abigail had unpinned the collar and folded it back, propriety, surrendering to survival the way it always did on the frontier. She changed into one of her plain dresses on the 3rd morning and folded the wedding dress carefully and laid it across the top of her bag. Helen Marsh watched her do it without comment. They talked during the long, hot miles. Helen told her about her sister's homestead, about the particular loneliness of the plains, about a woman she had known in Missouri who had come out west as a mail-order bride and found a man who read to her by firelight every evening and built her a proper kitchen with a window that faced east so she could see the sunrise while she cooked. "It doesn't always go wrong," Helen said. "That's what I'm telling you. I didn't agree to marry him," Abigail said. "My sister did. I'm going to tell him that." "And then what?" "And then whatever he decides is fair." Helen looked out the window at the land moving past gold and brown and enormous and indifferent. "What if he decides to keep you anyway?" Abigail didn't answer that. She looked out her own window and watched Wyoming come toward her mile by mile and tried not to think about the photograph tucked inside her ledger. Cheyenne hit her like a fist. She had grown up in a small town in Kansas where the tallest building was the grain elevator, and everyone knew everyone else's business and grief and bad luck by name. Cheyenne was different. Loud, dense, full of men moving fast with places to go, and transactions to complete the frontier in the process of becoming something else, something louder and more permanent, and not yet sure what that was. The stagecoach pulled into the station yard, and the driver called the stop, and Abigail sat for a moment in the sudden stillness of a journey ended. Helen Marsh touched her hand. "You know what you're going to say?" "Yes." "Say it fast," Helen said. "Men who work land for a living don't have patience for long explanations. Say it plain, and say it first, before he has a chance to decide what he thinks." Abigail nodded. She picked up her carpet bag. She stepped down from the coach. He was there. She recognized him from the photograph. The lean frame, the dark hat, the way he stood like he was part of whatever ground he happened to be standing on. He was taller than she had expected. There was a ranch hand beside him, a young man with red hair and a sunburned neck, and they were both scanning the passengers coming off the coach. Wyatt Callahan's eyes found her. They moved to the carpet bag, to her face, to the carpet bag again. He was looking for Clara. Abigail walked to him directly. She stopped 2 feet away, and she looked him straight in the eye, because Helen Marsh had said to say it fast and say it plain, and she intended to do exactly that. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "my name is Abigail Turner. I'm Clara Turner's older sister. Clara didn't come. She left before sunrise on the morning of departure, and I don't know where she is. I came in her place not to deceive you, but because someone needed to stand in front of you and tell you the truth to your face, instead of sending a telegram and hiding. The money your family paid has been spent on farm debts, and I cannot return it all at once, but I am prepared to offer you work or installment repayment, or whatever you consider a fair settlement for what was taken from you. I am sorry for what my sister did. I am sorry you were treated as anything less than a man deserving of honesty. That is all I have to say." She stopped. Her heart was hammering so hard, she was certain he could hear it. Wyatt Callahan looked at her for a long time. His expression was unreadable. The ranch hand beside him had gone very still, the way people go still when they can feel something significant happening and don't want to interrupt it. "How old are you?" Wyatt said. Of all the things Abigail had prepared for, that was not one of them. 29, she said. He looked at her for another moment. "How'd you get here?" "Stagecoach. 4 days." "Alone?" "Yes." Something shifted in his face then. Not softness exactly. More like the recalibration of an expectation. Like a man who had prepared himself for one kind of problem and found himself standing in front of a different one entirely. "You hungry?" he said. Abigail blinked. "I beg your pardon. I asked if you were hungry," Wyatt said. "It's a 4-day ride from Kansas. You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday. The hotel across the street has a decent dining room. We can talk settlement over food, or we can stand here in the station yard and see which of us goes down first from the heat." He picked up her carpet bag before she could stop him. "Either way, I'm not deciding anything on an empty stomach." He turned and walked toward the street. His ranch hand scrambled to follow. Abigail stood in the station yard for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands empty now where her bag had been, and then she walked after him, because what else was there to do? Helen Marsh, still gathering her own bags at the coach, watched her go. She looked like a woman watching something she had seen before. A woman walking into a future she hadn't planned for, carrying nothing but her own nerve and her own name moving forward, because standing still had never once been an option. The dining room was dim and cool after the brutal street. They sat at a corner table. Wyatt Callahan set her carpet bag on the floor beside her chair, removed his hat, and put it on the table, and Abigail got her first real look at his face. He was older than the photograph suggested, closer to 35 than 30, with the particular weathering of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a set to his jaw that came from years of making decisions that couldn't be undone. His hands, when they wrapped around the coffee mug, were rough and scarred and capable looking. He was not a soft man. But there was nothing cruel in him either. "My foreman's name is Dex Halley," Wyatt said. "He's the one who handled the correspondence. He's going to have questions." "I'll answer them," Abigail said. "He's not going to be polite about it." "I didn't come all this way to be treated politely," she said. "I came to make things right." Wyatt looked at her over his coffee mug. "What does making it right look like to you?" Abigail set her hands flat on the table. "I can work," she said. "I've kept accounts for 6 years. I can manage books, inventory correspondence, whatever a ranch operation needs in the way of records. I can cook, I can mend, I can do what's needed. Give me a month. Let me work off some portion of what you're owed, and give me time to arrange repayment of the rest." She met his eyes. "If at the end of a month you'd rather I went home, I'll go." No argument. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the dining room, the clink of cutlery, the low murmur of other conversations. The ordinary noise of people eating lunch in a world that had not stopped turning just because two strangers were sitting in a corner deciding what came next. "You'd stay in the spare room," Wyatt said. "There are 2 other ranch hands besides Dex, and they'll keep their distance. My nearest neighbor is a woman named Esther Boone, and she's—" He paused, choosing the word. "Particular about how things are done. She'll want to meet you." Abigail nodded. "All right. I'm not making any promises. I'm not asking for any." He looked at her again with that expression she couldn't quite read, the one that was neither warmth nor coldness, but something else. Something that felt like assessment, like a man measuring the distance between what he had expected and what was actually sitting across the table from him. "You got a lot of nerve," he said finally. "My mother would say stubbornness," Abigail said. "Nerve sounds better." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something. Outside the dining room windows, Cheyenne went about its loud, sun-hammered business. The stagecoach that had carried Abigail Turner 4 days through Kansas and into Wyoming was already loading its next passengers, already pointing itself toward the next horizon. Helen Marsh was somewhere in this city, making her own way toward her sister's homestead and 4 children and a grief that needed tending. And Abigail Turner, 29 years old, wearing a plain dress and carrying the weight of a wrong she had not committed, and the fierce, quiet determination to make it right anyway, picked up her coffee cup and drank. She had a month. She intended to use every single day of it. The wagon ride to the Callahan Ranch took the better part of the afternoon northwest out of Cheyenne into country that grew wilder and larger with every mile. The land out here was not like Kansas. Kansas was flat and open, and you could see trouble coming from a long way off. Wyoming had teeth ridgelines and draws and sudden valleys that appeared without warning, and the sky above it all was the particular blue of a place that had not yet decided to tolerate you. Abigail sat on the wagon bench beside Dex Halley, who turned out to be a compact, weathered man in his 40s with a jaw like a closed fist, and the disposition of someone who had already decided what he thought and was waiting to be proved right. Wyatt rode ahead on a dark horse. "So, you're the sister," Dex said. It was not a question. "I am," Abigail said. "The one who didn't run. The one who came instead." He chewed on that for a while. The wagon hit a rut, and both of them grabbed the bench rail. "He needed a wife," Dex said, "not a bookkeeper." "Then he should decide that," Abigail said. "Not you." Dex looked at her sideways. She looked straight ahead at the road, and at Wyatt's horse, moving through the afternoon light, and at the ranch appearing now at the end of the track. A good-sized house, solid and square. A barn that had been built to last, fence lines running straight and serious in every direction. It looked like a place a person could belong to. Abigail Turner told herself not to think that. She was here to make things right. She was here for a month. Whatever came after that was not something she was going to let herself want. Not yet. Not until she had earned the right to want anything at all. She stepped down from the wagon, picked up her carpet bag, and walked into the life she had not planned for. The spare room at the Callahan Ranch was small and smelled like cedar and old dust and the particular silence of a space that had never been used for anything warm. Abigail set her carpet bag on the floor, beside the narrow bed, sat down on the edge of the mattress, and let herself have exactly 60 seconds of feeling everything she had been holding back since Kansas. The exhaustion, the fear, the low, persistent shame of showing up in her sister's place like a substitute nobody had ordered. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed and counted, and when the 60 seconds were done, she stood up and started unpacking. She hung her 2 plain dresses on the wall pegs. She set her ledger on the small table by the window. She placed her father's folding knife in her boot, the way he had taught her the handle angled, so she could reach it without looking. Then she smoothed the quilt on the bed, went to the window, looked out at the ranch yard in the last light of the afternoon, and told herself the same thing she had been telling herself since she climbed into her sister's dress that morning back in Kansas. One day at a time. One right thing at a time. Dinner that first evening was not comfortable. Dex Halley sat across from her and ate with the focused intensity of a man who had decided that looking at his plate was preferable to acknowledging her existence. The 2 younger ranch hands, a boy named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 18, and a quiet man named Arlo, with a long jaw and careful eyes, both managed exactly one glance in her direction before finding their food fascinating. Wyatt sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing. He passed the biscuits when they got to his end. He refilled his coffee. He did not ignore her exactly, but he didn't perform welcome either, and Abigail appreciated that more than she would have appreciated false warmth. She passed the salt to Cody before he had to ask for it. He looked startled, like he hadn't expected her to notice. She had noticed. She always noticed things like that. It was how she had kept accounts for 6 years without a single error, the habit of attention, the instinct for what was needed before it was said out loud. After dinner, when Cody and Arlo had gone to the bunkhouse, and Wyatt had stepped outside to check on a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg, Dex Halley stayed at the table. He waited until the door closed behind Wyatt before he said anything. "I'll tell you how this goes," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. He spent $240. He waited 4 months for a woman who wrote back in a hand so pretty it near broke his heart to read it. And what showed up is you. He leaned forward. "I got nothing against you personally, Miss Turner, but you need to understand what you walked into." "My sister wrote those letters," Abigail said. "I know that now. She's not a bad person," Abigail said, "and she meant it even sitting here in the mess Clara had made. She was scared and she made a wrong choice. I'm not here to defend what she did, but I'm also not going to pretend I don't understand why she did it." Dex looked at her. "You defending her to me doesn't fix anything." "I know," Abigail said. "That's why I'm here instead of sending a telegram." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. "You know anything about cattle?" "No." "Ranch operations?" "Not yet." "What do you know?" "Accounts," she said. "Inventory. Correspondence. I know how to stretch a dollar and find where money's going that shouldn't be going anywhere. I know how to keep records that hold up in court." She met his eyes. "And I know how to work without being told twice." Dex looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, picked up his coffee mug and said, 5 in the morning. That's when the day starts here." He paused at the door. "Don't be late." She wasn't. She was up at 4:30, dressed and in the kitchen before anyone else. And when Wyatt came through the back door at 5 past 5, he found her at the stove with coffee made and bacon going, and a pot of oats on the back burner. He stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Where do you keep your ledgers?" He blinked. The shift was so fast it threw him one sentence about breakfast and the next about business. No pause, no softness in between. "Desk in the front room," he said. "Second drawer." "Thank you," she said. "Breakfast in 10 minutes." He went and sat down, and she heard him in the front room, the sound of the drawer opening, and then nothing for a while. She dished up plates for when the men came in, and when Wyatt came back to the table, he had a leather-bound ledger in his hand, and an expression on his face she hadn't seen before. "These haven't been reconciled in 4 months, he said. "I know," she said. "I looked." "You looked at my books. You told me where they were. I looked." She set a plate in front of him. "You've got a discrepancy in the feed account. Somebody's been billing you for 60 pounds of oats a week, and you've got 3 horses. That's either very hungry horses or somebody taking money that isn't theirs." Wyatt sat down slowly. He looked at the plate. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "How long did that take you to find?" he said. "About 20 minutes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Dex handles the purchasing." "Then Dex should be able to explain it," she said. "Maybe there's a record I didn't see. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm telling you what the numbers say." He opened the ledger again. She sat down across from him with her own coffee and her own plate and let him look. Outside the window, the ranch was waking up the sound of boots on the bunkhouse steps. Cody's voice saying something to Arlo, the particular morning sounds of a working place coming to life. When Dex came in 10 minutes later and saw Wyatt sitting at the table with the ledger open between them and Abigail Turner sitting across from him with a pencil in her hand and a column of figures written on the inside cover of her own notebook, the foreman went very still. "Morning," Abigail said. Dex looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him with an expression that was not accusatory, but was absolutely unyielding. "Sit down, Dex," he said. "Tell me about the oat account." What followed was not comfortable, but it was necessary, and Abigail sat quietly through it with her hands folded and let the men work it out between them. It turned out the billing discrepancy was not theft. It was a supplier error that Dex had been meaning to address for 3 months and kept forgetting, the kind of small administrative failure that accumulated on working ranches where every day brought a new emergency and paperwork fell to the bottom of every list. Dex was angry in the defensive way of a man who knew he should have caught it himself. Wyatt was controlled in the way of a man who stored everything up and dealt with it privately. By the time breakfast was finished, the matter was resolved and a letter was being drafted to the supplier, and Dex Halley, for the first time since she'd arrived, looked at Abigail Turner with something other than flat assessment. He didn't say thank you, but he refilled her coffee mug before he refilled his own. She counted that. The days fell into rhythm. She was up first and to bed last, and in between, she worked the books in the morning, the house in the afternoon, whatever needed doing in the evening. She didn't ask permission for any of it. She moved through the ranch the way she had always moved through difficult situations, which was steadily and without fanfare, making herself useful in ways that couldn't be argued with. Wyatt watched her. He wasn't subtle about it, but he wasn't intrusive either. She would look up from the desk sometimes and find him in the doorway of the front room leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and that unreadable expression on his face, and she would look back down at her ledger and keep working, and he would eventually move on. She didn't know what he was looking for. She didn't ask. On the 5th day, he said, "You don't have to do the laundry." "I know," she said. "That's the 3rd time you've said that." "Because it's the 3rd time it's been true," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Why do you do it then?" She set down the shirt she was mending and looked at him directly. "Because I owe you a debt, and this is how I'm paying it. Not because somebody told me to. Not because I want something from you. Because it's right." She picked the shirt back up. "Is that a satisfactory answer?" He said, "Yes," and left her to it. But she heard him pause at the bottom of the porch steps before his boots moved on, and she knew he was still turning it over. The nearest neighbor, Esther Boone, arrived on the 6th day. She drove her own wagon, and she drove it fast, and she came through the ranch gate with the particular energy of a woman who had decided something and intended to see it through. She was somewhere in her 60s, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered with silver hair, pinned up in a style that suggested she had once cared considerably about appearances, and now reserved that energy for things she considered more worthy. She looked at Abigail on the porch and said, "So you're the one." "I suppose I am," Abigail said. "Heard about the sister business," Esther said, climbing down from the wagon with the ease of someone who had been doing it for 50 years. "Heard you came anyway." "Yes, ma'am." Esther came up the porch steps and looked at her clothes, the way an older woman looks at a younger one when she's deciding whether there's something real there or just the performance of something real. It was not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of. Abigail held still and let her look. "You running from something," Esther said. "No, ma'am. Running toward something." "I'm trying to make something right," Abigail said. "That's all." Esther held her gaze for another moment. Then she nodded once the way a judge nods when she's heard enough to make a ruling. "Come on then," she said. "I've got preserves in the wagon, and I want coffee, and you look like somebody who can hold a decent conversation." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Esther talked about the county, the neighboring ranches, the politics of land and water that shaped everything out here, whether you wanted it to or not. She talked about a man named Silas Greer, who had been buying up grazing rights along the eastern ridge and whose methods of persuasion were not always what she would call above board. She talked about the railroad survey that had been going through the county for the past year and what it meant for land values, and who stood to gain from which outcome. Abigail listened and asked the occasional careful question, and Esther answered each one with the directness of a woman who respected being asked. When she was leaving, Esther paused at the door and looked back. "He's not a hard man," she said. "He's a careful one. There's a difference." She tucked her shawl around her shoulders. "Clara Turner would have broken him, I think. She sounds like the kind of woman who needs somebody easier than Wyatt Callahan, somebody who laughs more." Abigail didn't say anything to that. "You don't need easy, do you?" Esther said. It wasn't a question. She drove her wagon back down the track, and Abigail stood on the porch and watched her go, and tried very hard not to think about what she had just said. It was on the 9th day that things broke open. Abigail had been at the desk since early afternoon working through the land records. Wyatt had handed her a box of documents the day before and said simply, "Esther says I've been paying more in grazing fees than I should. See if she's right." And she was 3 hours into it when she found the discrepancy. Not a billing error this time. Something different. Something that made her sit back in her chair and go very still. One of the grazing parcels on the Eastern Ridge parcel, 14C on the county survey map, had been filed as vacant in the land records. But Abigail had the original deed right here in this box, and the deed said it belonged to the Callahan Ranch. Had belonged since 1871. And if the county records showed it as vacant, that meant somebody had changed those records. And the timing of that change, she checked the date on the filing, checked it twice, was 4 months ago. Right around the time the railroad survey had come through. Right around the time Silas Greer had started buying up grazing rights along the Eastern Ridge. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote down 3 names, 3 dates, and 2 parcel numbers, and she took the page into the kitchen where Wyatt was eating supper, and she set it on the table in front of him and said, "I need you to look at this." He looked at it. She watched his face change. "Where did you find this?" he said. His voice was quiet, the way voices went quiet when something serious dropped into the room. "In your own deed box," she said. "You had it the whole time. You just didn't know what you were looking at because nobody ever sat down and put the county filings next to the original documents." Wyatt was on his feet. "Dex," he called loud enough to carry to the bunkhouse. "Dex, get in here." Dex came at a run, and Cody behind him, and Abigail stepped back and let the men converge on the table and the documents and the 3 names and 2 parcel numbers she had written down, and she watched Dex read it, and she watched the color leave his face, and then come back in a rush of something that was not embarrassment this time, but anger, clean direct, the anger of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Silas Greer," Dex said. "It looks that way," Abigail said. "He was out here 3 weeks ago," Cody said. "Talking to the old man at the ridge fence. I saw them." He looked at Wyatt. "I didn't think anything of it." The room went tight. The kind of tight that happens when several people realize simultaneously that something has been going on right under their noses, and the window for stopping it easily is already closing. Wyatt looked at Abigail. His eyes were clear and direct, and there was something in them that she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, but something that ran deeper than gratitude. Recognition. The particular look of a person who has just understood that someone else was paying attention when everyone else wasn't. "How long do we have?" he said. "If Greer files an occupancy claim on that parcel," she said, "and if the county records already show it as vacant, he could have legal standing before the end of the month. You need a lawyer, and you need the original deed filed at the courthouse with a counter affidavit before he moves." "There's a lawyer in Cheyenne," Dex said. "There's one in town who owes me a favor," Wyatt said. He was already reaching for his hat. He looked at Abigail. "Can you write up what you found, the whole thing documented in order? Something I can put in front of a lawyer tomorrow morning and have him understand in 10 minutes. "Yes," she said. "How long, Bez?" 2 hours, she said. "Maybe less." He put on his hat. "I'll be back at first light. Document everything." He paused at the door and looked back at her with that same expression she couldn't quite name. "Miss Turner." "Mr. Callahan." "Thank you," he said. Then he was gone, and she sat back down at the desk, and she pulled the documents toward her, and she started writing. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and dark, and full of the particular silence of a land that had been fought over for as long as anyone could remember. Abigail Turner lit another lamp and kept her head down and worked. She had been brought here to make something right. She was starting to understand that what needed making right was bigger than anyone had known when she first walked into it. Wyatt was back before sunrise. Abigail heard the horse come into the yard at 4 in the morning, and she was already awake, already dressed, already sitting at the desk with the completed document in front of her. 12 pages, every discrepancy cataloged, every date, cross-referenced, every parcel number matched against both the original deed and the falsified county filing. She had gone through it 3 times. It was clean and it was airtight, and she knew it. She heard his boots on the porch steps, and she stood up, and when he came through the door, she handed him the document without saying anything. He took it, sat down at the table, and read. She stood by the window and let him read. She didn't pace. She didn't explain. She had said everything that needed saying in the 12 pages, and anything she added now would just be noise. He read for 15 minutes without looking up. When he finished, he set the document on the table and pressed his hand flat on top of it like he was making sure it was real. "This is everything," he said. "Everything I could find in one night," she said. "There may be more. Greer's been careful, but not careful enough. The dates on the county filings don't match the notary stamps. Whoever altered those records either didn't notice or didn't think anyone would look close enough to catch it." "Would a lawyer catch it?" "Any lawyer worth what you'd pay him would catch it in 5 minutes," she said. "The question is whether Greer has already got to the county clerk." Wyatt looked at her. "What makes you think he might have?" "Because the filing was 4 months ago and nobody caught it," she said. "That's either incompetence or it's something else." She paused. "I don't know this county. You do." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. "The county clerk's name is Patterson," he said. "He and Greer play cards on Fridays." The silence that followed that statement had weight to it. "Then you need the lawyer first," Abigail said, "before Greer knows you found this. If Patterson tips him off before you file the counter affidavit, you lose the window." Wyatt was already standing. "I'll ride to Cheyenne at first light. Take the document," she said. "And take the original deed. Don't leave either of them here." He looked at her. "You think Greer would come here?" "I think a man who's already changed county records once doesn't stop at one thing," she said. "I think you should ride to Cheyenne, and I think Dex should know why, and I think somebody should be watching the eastern fence line today." She said it evenly without alarm, the way you said things that needed saying. "That's what I think." Wyatt Callahan looked at Abigail Turner in the gray pre-dawn light of his front room, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "All right," he said. He picked up the document and the deed. "Tell Dex when he gets up. Tell him everything." "I will." He started for the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "You slept at all?" "A little," she said, which was not true but was close enough. He nodded once, then he was gone. Abigail went to the kitchen and built up the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the stove in the quiet, and let herself feel the particular feeling of having done something that mattered. It was a small feeling and a large one at the same time. She had felt it before at the hardware store when she caught a billing error that would have cost her employer 3 months of profit. She had felt it at the kitchen table in Kansas reading Wyatt Callahan's letters, and thinking, without letting herself think it too clearly, that whoever ended up with this man was going to be all right. She poured herself coffee and went back to the desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started making a list of everything else she needed to check. Dex came in at 5 and she told him everything. She put the pages in front of him the way she had done with Wyatt and let him read, and she watched his jaw tighten and his eyes go flat and still, the way eyes did when a man was converting surprise into action. "Greer's boy was in town last Tuesday," Dex said, asking questions at the land office. "About this parcel. About several parcels. I heard it secondhand from Arlo." He looked up from the pages. "I didn't put it together." "You couldn't have without these," she said. "The picture doesn't make sense until you have all the pieces." He was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know to look?" "Esther Boone said the grazing fees were off," she said. "So I looked at the grazing parcels, and when something doesn't add up, you don't stop at the number that's wrong, you follow it back until you find where the error started." She picked up her coffee. The error didn't start with a billing mistake. It started with a deed. Dex folded his hands on the table. He had the look of a man recalibrating something he had already decided, dismantling an assessment he had built over a week and examining the parts. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I wasn't exactly welcoming when you arrived." "You were protecting him," she said. "That's your job." "Still." "Apology accepted," she said. "Now tell me about Silas Greer." What Dex told her over the next hour was not comforting. Silas Greer was not a man who operated through open hostility. He was a man who operated through paperwork and proxies and the patient accumulation of small advantages that only became visible once they were large enough to be irreversible. He had taken 3 other ranches in the county over the past 4 years, not by force, but by filing by fees, by the slow strangulation of grazing rights and water access, until the owners either sold or defaulted. He was patient and methodical, and he had apparently been planning his move on the Callahan Eastern Ridge for the better part of a year. He picked his moment, Dex said. When Wyatt was distracted, when there was all the business with the bride arrangement, the correspondence, the waiting. He said it without looking at her. Greer would have known. In a county this size, everybody knows. He thought Wyatt would be off balance, Abigail said. He was right, Dex said. Up until about 9 days ago. The morning moved fast after that. Cody was sent to watch the eastern fence. Arlo was dispatched to Esther Boone with a note from Abigail explaining what she had found and asking what Esther knew about the county clerk, Patterson. Abigail went back to the desk and kept working, pulling every land document out of the box and going through each one with the same systematic attention she had given the first. She found 2 more irregularities before noon. Neither was as significant as the first, but both were consistent with the same pattern. Small alterations plausible at a glance, only visible if you were looking for them and knew what you were looking at. She added them to the document. She made copies by hand because there was no other way to make copies, and her hand was steady and her writing was clear, and she did not allow herself to rush even when she could feel the pressure of the clock. Esther Boone arrived at 2 in the afternoon, driving her wagon faster than she had the first time. She came through the door without knocking, took off her coat, dropped it on the nearest chair, and said, "Patterson took a trip to Cheyenne last month. 3 days. Stayed at the hotel where Greer's mining attorney keeps an office." She pulled out a chair and sat down. "I made some inquiries." "How?" Abigail said. "I've been in this county for 31 years. Esther said. "I know who talks and who listens, and who does both for the price of a good meal." She looked at the papers spread across the desk. "What else did you find?" Abigail showed her the 2 new irregularities. Esther looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "He's been planning this since the railroad survey, maybe before." She sat back. This isn't about grazing rights. He wants the whole eastern quarter. Why? Because the railroad's coming through in 2 years, and the eastern quarter is where the depot goes. Esther looked at her with eyes that had seen enough of the world to be entirely without illusions. That land will be worth 10 times what it is now, maybe more. Greer knows it. He's been positioning himself for 2 years. The room went still. Wyatt doesn't know about the depot, Abigail said. Nobody does officially, Esther said. But Greer has a cousin who works for the railroad surveying company. He's had the information for a year. She paused. That's why the timing of the deed alteration. That's why 4 months ago, he needed to establish the vacancy claim before the railroad route became public knowledge. Abigail sat very still for a moment, letting it all settle into its proper shape. The full picture. The whole architecture of it patient, methodical, and now racing against a clock that Greer had set himself, and that was running in his favor. How long until the route becomes public? She said. 6 weeks, Esther said. Maybe 8. And if Wyatt doesn't have the counter-affidavit filed before Greer makes his occupancy claim, then the legal fight goes on for years and costs more than the land is worth at current prices, Esther said. And Greer knows that too. Abigail stood up. She went to the window, not to look at anything in particular, but because she needed to move while she thought. 6 weeks. Wyatt in Cheyenne right now with a lawyer. The document she had written 12 pages clean and complete. The original deed. The question was whether it was enough. Whether 1 night of work and 12 pages of careful documentation could outrun a year of patient methodical corruption. It's enough, Esther said, as if she had said the question out loud. If the lawyer is worth anything, and if Wyatt gets in front of the judge before Patterson gets word to Greer. She paused. Is Wyatt the kind of man who moves fast when he has to? I think so, Abigail said. Yes. Then it's enough, Esther said again more firmly. The storm came that evening with almost no warning. The sky to the west had been building all afternoon, the kind of building that people who lived on the plains learned to read, the way other people read faces. The particular shade of green at the horizon, the way the wind stopped entirely about an hour before everything broke loose. Cody came in from the eastern fence at 5 and looked at the sky and said, "That's bad." He was right. It hit at 7. Not rain first the way storms usually came, but wind, a wall of it that came over the ridge and hit the ranch buildings with a sound like something tearing, and then the rain behind it, heavy and cold and serious. The kind of rain that turned the pastures into moving water in under an hour. Abigail was in the kitchen when it broke. Dex was at the barn door in 30 seconds, Cody right behind him. Arlo came running from the bunkhouse with his hat already gone. "The lower pasture," Dex shouted over the rain. "The creek floods. We've got cattle down there." "How many?" Abigail called. 30 head, maybe more. He looked at her. "We need every hand." She was already moving toward the door. "Tell me what to do." Dex looked at her for 1 second, that same assessing look she had been getting since she arrived, but different now, faster, more pragmatic. And then he said, "Can you ride?" "Yes," she said. It was true. Not well, not the way these men rode, but she had ridden since she was a girl. And she could stay on, and she could follow direction, and right now, that was what was needed. "Then ride," he said. The horse they gave her was a steady roan mare named Cass, who moved through the dark and the rain with the calm professionalism of an animal that had done this before. Abigail stayed low and followed Dex's lantern through the black and the water and the noise of the storm, and tried to keep track of where she was by landmark and instinct, because there was no other way to navigate. The lower pasture was already flooding. She could hear the cattle before she could see them. The particular sound of frightened animals in water, a sound that cut right through everything else. Dex shouted instructions, and she followed them. The work was physical and immediate, and left no room for thought. Open this gate, cut this fence section, drive this animal toward higher ground, go back for the next one. She lost her hat in the first 10 minutes. Her boots filled with water. At some point, she stopped being cold because there was no spare attention available for being cold. Wyatt found them an hour into it. He had ridden back from Cheyenne ahead of the storm and come straight to the lower pasture, and he arrived in the middle of it, materialized out of the rain and the dark on his dark horse. And the first thing he did was take in the situation, and the second thing he did was look for Abigail and find her waist-deep in the flooding ditch, hauling a calf out by its front legs, while Cody held the rope. He rode straight to her. "Give me the rope." "I've got it," she said. She was not being stubborn. She literally had it, and she was not going to let go, because the calf was almost out, and letting go now would mean starting over. She got the calf out. It scrambled up the bank, and Cody caught it and drove it toward the others on higher ground. And Abigail stood in the ditch in the water and pushed her soaked hair back from her face and looked up at Wyatt on his horse above her. He looked back at her for a moment that was suspended out of time, out of the rain and the noise and the urgency. He was soaked through too, his hat dark with water, and there was something on his face that was not the expression she had seen before. Not assessment. Not the careful recalibration of a man revising his expectations. Something more direct than that. "Lawyer says we have a case," he said. He had to say it loud over the rain. "Filed the counter affidavit today. Judge is a fair man. Patterson already tried to send word to Greer and the lawyer was 3 steps ahead of him." He paused. "It worked." Abigail stood in the ditch in the floodwater and felt something release in her chest that had been wound tight since the night she found the deed discrepancy. She didn't say anything. She didn't have the words for it right then. "The calf," she said instead. "There's one more." "I see it," Wyatt said. He swung down from his horse and landed beside her in the ditch, and the water came up to his knees, and he looked at her once more before they both turned toward the work. "Come on," he said. They worked side by side through the rest of the storm. No more words, just the immediate physical fact of the work, the animals, the water, the fence sections, the dark. Abigail worked until her arms ached and her boots were ruined, and the rain finally began to thin out somewhere around midnight. They got all 30 head to higher ground. Not one lost. When it was over, when the last animal was accounted for and Cody and Arlo had gone back to the bunkhouse and Dex had gone to check on the barn roof, Abigail stood in the mud at the edge of the upper pasture and tried to remember when she had last been this tired. She could not remember. She thought maybe she had never been this tired. Wyatt stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The rain had gone to a fine mist, and the dark was lifting incrementally at the eastern edge of the sky, the gray beginning that came before anything that could be called light. "You didn't have to ride out," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. "Why?" She looked at him. He was looking at her, and the question was real, not rhetorical, not a test. He actually wanted to know. "Because this is your land," she said. "And while I'm here, what's yours is worth protecting." She paused. "That's all." He was quiet for a moment. The gray at the horizon deepened. Somewhere behind the barn, a horse moved and settled. "Dex told me," Wyatt said, "about everything you did today. The documents, Esther, the lists." "Dex could have done it." "Dex didn't," he said. "You did." He looked straight ahead. "You've been here 11 days. "I know. I told you I wasn't making any promises." "I remember," she said. "I'm not taking that back," he said. "But I want you to know." He stopped. He was not a man who said difficult things easily. She could see him working toward it, the way a man worked toward a fence line in bad weather, steady and committed, and not at all certain of what he'd find when he got there. "I want you to know that what you did matters, not just the documents, all of it. Every day." He looked at her. "You didn't have to come here. You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to ride out tonight. You've done all of it without being asked, and without making me feel like I owe you something for it. And I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I know it matters." Abigail looked back at the lightening horizon. She had come here to make something right. She had told herself that 100 times in the past 11 days. What she had not told herself, what she had been very careful not to let herself think too clearly, was what it felt like to stand in this place beside this man in the aftermath of a hard night and feel for the first time in 29 years like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't say any of that. "Get some sleep, Mr. Callahan," she said. "We've got work in the morning." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. She didn't look to check. She walked back toward the house through the thinning dark and didn't let herself look back, because looking back was how you tripped over things, and she had come too far and worked too hard to fall down now. The morning after the storm, the ranch looked like something that had been wrung out and set back down, crooked. Fence posts leaning. Mud everywhere. The lower pasture still holding 2 inches of standing water that caught the early light and threw it back in flat silver sheets. Cody was out before anyone else, walking the fence line with a hammer and a bucket of staples, cataloging the damage with the methodical patience of someone who had done it enough times to stop being surprised by how much a single night of weather could undo. Abigail was at the desk by 6 with coffee she didn't taste, and the land documents spread in front of her again. She had slept 4 hours. It was enough. She had run on less. The counter affidavit was filed. That was the anchor. Everything else that needed doing could be organized around that fact. She made a new list. The 2 secondary irregularities she had found, the question of Patterson's involvement and what that meant for the integrity of the other county filings. The question of what else Greer might have already set in motion that they hadn't found yet. She wrote it all down in her clean, precise hand, and she prioritized it. And when Wyatt came in at 6:30 and poured his coffee and sat down across from her, she pushed the list across the table without preamble. He read it. He didn't say good morning, and neither did she. That had stopped being necessary around day 7. "You think there's more," he said. "I think a man who's been planning this for a year doesn't have only one strategy," she said. "The deed alteration was the primary move, but patient men have backup plans." He looked at the list. "Water rights," he said. "That's what you wrote here." "The creek that flooded last night feeds the lower pasture from the north ridge," she said. "I looked at your water rights filing when I was going through the land box. It's registered to the ranch, but the registration is from 1869. If Greer or someone working for him filed an upstream diversion claim in the last year, you might not know about it until the dry season, when the water stops coming." Wyatt set down his coffee mug. He was very still. "Dex," he said, not loud, just directing the word toward the back door, where Dex's boots had just come up the porch steps. Dex came in, read Wyatt's face, and sat down without being asked. "Check the water rights records in Cheyenne today," Wyatt said. "All upstream filings on the North Ridge Creek for the past 18 months. Dex looked at Abigail. She looked back at him calmly. "All right," Dex said. He stood back up, picked up a biscuit from the plate on the counter, and walked back out. No argument, no hesitation. The shift in how he received her conclusions had happened somewhere in the night of the storm, the way certain shifts happened, not announced, just suddenly present. Wyatt picked up his coffee again. "How are your hands?" Abigail looked down. Her palms were raw from the rope work the night before, the skin chafed and broken in 2 places. She had wrapped them in clean cloth this morning. "Fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." "I know," she said. "They're sore. They'll heal. It's not a problem." He held her gaze for a moment. "You should let me—" "Wyatt." She said it quietly. Not sharp, just direct. "I have been taking care of my own hands for 29 years. Let me keep doing it." He closed his mouth. Something moved in his expression, not offense, not quite amusement either. Something between the two that she was beginning to recognize as his version of conceding a point gracefully. "Stubborn," he said. "My mother's word," she said. "You can use it." The corner of his mouth moved. She looked back down at her list. Silas Greer came to the ranch that same afternoon. He did not send word ahead. He simply rode in through the front gate at 2 in the afternoon with 2 men behind him, and tied his horse to the rail like he had done it 100 times before, which perhaps he had, in the days when the Callahan Ranch had been less organized about its paperwork. Abigail heard the horses from the desk. She was at the window in time to see Greer dismount a heavy-set man in his 50s, well-dressed for the county, the kind of well-dressed that announced money made faster than taste could keep up with. He had a wide-brimmed hat and a manner of moving that suggested he expected the ground to accommodate him rather than the other way around. She went to the front door and opened it before he knocked. That stopped him for half a second. People who liked to control entrances did not enjoy having the door opened before they reached it. She had learned that at the hardware store dealing with suppliers who came in with inflated invoices and the expectation of an unprepared bookkeeper. "Miss," Greer said. His eyes moved over her quickly, dismissing refiling. "I'm here to see Callahan." "He's in the barn," she said. "I can get him, or I can take a message." "I'll wait inside," Greer said, and moved as if to step forward. "I'll get him," Abigail said. She did not move out of the doorway. She said it pleasantly without hostility, as if the alternative he had suggested simply hadn't registered as a real option. "It won't take a minute." Greer stopped. He looked at her more carefully this time, not dismissing now, recalibrating. "You're the woman Callahan brought out from Kansas," he said. "I came from Kansas," she said. "I'd say that's close enough." "You the bride he sent for." "I'm Abigail Turner," she said. "I'll get Mr. Callahan." She went to get Wyatt without waiting for a response, and she did not hurry, because hurrying would have told Greer something she didn't want him to know, which was that the sight of him on this property made her stomach tighten with the specific unease of someone who understood exactly what he was capable of and how little of it showed on the surface. Wyatt came out of this barn with Cody at his shoulder, and his expression set in the careful neutral of a man who had been expecting this visit and had decided in advance how he intended to conduct it. Greer met him in the yard. His two men stayed by the horses. "Wyatt," Greer said with the easy familiarity of a man who used first names as a dominance tool. "Heard you had a rough night. Storm take much?" "Nothing we didn't recover," Wyatt said. "Good, good." Greer pushed his hat back. "I wanted to come talk to you personally. Man to man, neighbor to neighbor. I understand there's been some confusion about the Eastern Ridge parcels. My attorney filed some paperwork a few months back, and I think there may have been some overlap with your old deed." The word overlap landed in the air between them, like something dropped deliberately. "Overlap," Wyatt said. "These things happen with old records," Greer said. "County filing system is a mess, you know that. What I'm suggesting is, we settle this between ourselves, save everybody the cost and inconvenience of lawyers and courtrooms." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for the parcel in question. More than fair, honestly. You'd walk away with good money, and nobody has to spend the next year in depositions." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He looked at Greer with those dark, steady eyes, and Greer looked back with the practiced warmth of a man who had made this kind of offer before and expected it to work. "I filed a counter-affidavit yesterday," Wyatt said. "The judge received it this morning." The warmth in Greer's face thinned by exactly the amount it would take to let you know it had been constructed. "Well," he said. "That's your right, of course." He paused. "Though I have to say, going the legal route on something like this, it gets expensive, gets complicated, and it puts a lot of attention on both parties that a man in your position might not want, especially with other matters still being sorted out." His eyes moved to Abigail, who was standing at the corner of the porch. Just a flick, just enough. Wyatt stepped forward. Not much, just one step, but it changed the geometry of everything. "You look at her again like that," he said very quietly, "and this conversation is over in a way you won't enjoy." The two men by the horses shifted. Cody at Wyatt's shoulder was absolutely motionless, the kind of motionless that people who understood conflict recognized as its own form of readiness. Greer put his hands back in his pockets and reassembled his smile. "I'm just saying there are easier ways to handle this." "I'm sure you are," Wyatt said. "The answer's no. The parcel belongs to this ranch. The records show it. The judge will see it. And if I find out Patterson gave you any information about my filing before it was public record, that becomes a separate matter for a separate court." He tilted his head slightly. "That everything you came to say?" Greer looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the porch, not at Abigail specifically, but at the porch at the house at the organized and functioning yard of a ranch that should have been scrambling and disorganized by now if his timeline had gone the way he planned. "Smart woman you've got there," he said. His voice was light conversational, the tone of a man who wanted you to think the next thing he said was casual. Be a shame if her sister's whereabouts became a matter of public record. Runaway bride, broken contract, the kind of story that travels in a small county. The air went still. Abigail came off the porch. She did it without deciding to. One moment she was standing at the corner post, and the next she was walking across the yard, and she stopped 3 feet from Silas Greer and looked him straight in the face. "My sister's choices are her own business," she said. "She owes this ranch a debt, and that debt is being settled honestly. Any man who uses a woman's private life as a threat in a land dispute is telling you everything you need to know about how he does business." She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. And any judge who hears that you said what you just said in this yard in front of witnesses is going to find it very interesting reading alongside the documentation of what you did to those county records. Greer looked at her. Really looked at her this time. Not the quick dismissal of the doorway, not the flick of manipulation, but an actual assessment of what he was dealing with. He did not like what he found. "Miss Turner," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. "I think you came here to see how organized we were. Now you know. I'd suggest you talk to your attorney before your next visit." The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Greer picked up his reins. His 2 men mounted. He looked at Wyatt one more time with the eyes of a man storing something away for later, and then he rode out of the yard at a controlled pace that was the closest thing to retreat he was willing to perform. Nobody spoke until the sound of hooves faded. Then Cody let out a breath and said, "Lord Almighty." Dex, who had appeared at the barn door at some point during the confrontation and witnessed the last half of it, walked across the yard and stopped beside Abigail and said without looking at her, "You know he's going to come back at this from a different angle." "I know," she said. "He's got money and he's got time and he doesn't lose gracefully." "I know that too," she said. "So what do we do?" She looked at the gate where Greer's dust was still settling. "We make sure every document is correct, every record is current, and every piece of evidence is organized and ready before he finds his next angle." She paused. "And we talked to Esther Boone about who else in this county Greer has tried to squeeze. Because a man who's done this to us has done it to someone else, and those people might be willing to file alongside us." Dex was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking of a joint filing. I'm thinking that a single ranch fighting a land fraud case is expensive and slow," she said. 3 or 4 ranches with documented evidence of the same pattern of fraud is a different kind of case entirely. She turned and went back into the house. Behind her, she heard Wyatt say quietly to no one in particular, "Yeah, just that. Just the one word." But she heard what was underneath it. 2 days later, Esther Boone came back with 2 women Abigail had not met. Martha Wren, whose husband had sold their eastern pasture to Greer 18 months ago under circumstances. Martha described as neither voluntary nor honest. And Caroline Pell, a widow who had been fighting an upstream water diversion claim for 7 months and was nearly out of money to continue the fight. They sat around Wyatt's kitchen table, and Abigail laid out what she had found, and Esther added what she knew, and Martha and Caroline added what they had, and by the end of 2 hours, the shape of Greer's operation was visible in its entirety, not just the Callahan Ranch, not just the Eastern Ridge, but a systematic, patient, years-long campaign to consolidate the land that would become valuable when the railroad depot location became public. Martha Wren spread her hands flat on the table and looked at the documents. "My husband thought he was bad at business," she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. "He thought he'd missed something, made some mistake. He blamed himself until the day he died." Nobody said anything for a moment. "He didn't miss anything," Abigail said. "The records were changed. He was reading falsified documents. There was no mistake he could have caught." She met Martha's eyes. "That's what this shows. That's what a judge will see." Martha looked at the documents for a long time. Then she said, "What do we need to do?" "Sign affidavits," Abigail said. "Gather every original document you have. Deeds, water rights correspondence, anything with a date and a signature. Bring them here and let me go through them the same way I went through Wyatt's. Whatever Greer altered, we find it. Whatever he forged, we document it." She paused. "And then we go to Cheyenne with everything, and we let the lawyer build the case." Wyatt had been leaning against the wall through all of this. Listening, his arms crossed his face, doing the thing it did when he was absorbing something large and converting it into plan. He pushed off the wall now and looked at Abigail and said, "How long?" "2 weeks," she said. "Maybe 3. He nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." Esther looked at Wyatt with the expression of a woman who had known him a long time and was seeing something in him she had been waiting to see. She didn't comment on it directly. She looked at Abigail instead and said quietly enough that it was meant only for her. 3 weeks ago he was waiting on a bride he didn't know. "Yes," Abigail said. "Funny how things work out," Esther said. Abigail picked up her pencil and went back to her list. "Let's not count anything yet," she said. "We have work to do." But she allowed herself just for a moment, just the space of one breath to feel the truth of it. The strange, sideways, unplanned truth of how she had ended up here at this table in this county, doing work that mattered beside people who were beginning to trust her in a house that was starting quietly, and without her permission to feel like something she did not want to leave. Then she put her head down, and she worked, because that was what she did. And because the work was real, and the case was not yet won, and wanting something was only worth anything if you were willing to earn it. The 3 weeks that followed were the hardest and the most clarifying of Abigail Turner's life. She worked from before sunrise to well past dark every day. Martha Wren brought 2 boxes of documents the first morning: deeds, letters, water rights, filings, a stack of receipts from the land office, going back 6 years. And Abigail went through every page, the same way she had gone through Wyatt's, systematically, chronologically building the picture from the ground up. Carolyn Pell brought her own records 2 days later, thinner files, but with a clarity that made the pattern unmistakable once you laid them alongside the others. 3 ranches, 3 sets of documents, 3 versions of the same story told in different handwriting on different paper with different dates. And underneath all of them, the same methodology, the same careful falsification, the same patient architecture of theft. Abigail cross-referenced everything. She built a master timeline on 4 large sheets of paper she pinned to the wall of the front room, and Wyatt came in on the 3rd evening and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. "How many alterations total?" he said finally. 11 confirmed, she said. 3 more probable, but I need 1 more document to close the chain. She pointed to a gap in the timeline. "The water rights diversion Greer filed on the North Ridge Creek. I need the original survey map from 1868 to prove the creek ran on your land before the diversion claim was filed. Without it, that piece of the case has a hole." "Where's the survey map?" "County Records Office," she said, "which is where Patterson works." The silence that fell between them had the particular texture of a problem that had no clean solution. "I'll go," Wyatt said. "Patterson will know what you're looking for the moment you ask for it," she said. "He'll find a reason the map isn't available. He'll say it's misfiled or damaged or being reviewed. He'll stall long enough to give Greer time to respond." She paused. "But if someone he doesn't recognize goes in and requests a routine survey review for a different parcel nearby and happens to look at the adjacent maps while they're at the records desk?" Wyatt looked at her. "You're talking about yourself." "Patterson has never seen me," she said. "All he knows is that Wyatt Callahan has a woman from Kansas staying at the ranch. He doesn't know what I look like. He doesn't know my name." "Abigail." "I've been in land records offices before," she said. "I spent 2 years filing documents for the hardware store's property holdings. I know how those offices work, and I know how to look like I belong there." She met his eyes. "It's the cleanest way to get what we need." He didn't like it. She could see that clearly. He was a man who dealt with problems directly face forward and sending someone else into a situation with any degree of risk went against something fundamental in him. But he was also a man who listened to reason, and the reason was sound, and he knew it. "Dex goes with you," he said. "Dex waits outside with the wagon," she said. "He doesn't come in." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "If anything feels wrong, I'll walk out," she said. "I'm not brave, Wyatt. I'm practical. There's a difference." He looked at her with that expression she had stopped trying to categorize, the one that lived somewhere between concern and something warmer and more complicated, and then he said, "All right." She went to Cheyenne on a Thursday morning with Dex driving the wagon and a plain dress she had never worn to the ranch, and her hair done differently than usual, and a request form for a routine boundary survey on a parcel 3 miles from the one she actually needed. She was calm the whole ride in. She had been nervous before, waiting for the stagecoach back in Kansas, standing outside the hotel in Cheyenne with Wyatt's photograph in her ledger. She was not nervous now. She had been on this land for 26 days. She knew what she was fighting for. Patterson was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the distracted manner of someone perpetually behind on their filing. He took her request form without looking at her face, pointed her to the map drawers on the east wall, and went back to his correspondence. She thanked him pleasantly and went to the map drawers, and she found the 1868 survey map in 11 minutes, and she stood at the records table with her back to Patterson, and she looked at it, and she found exactly what she had known she would find. The North Ridge Creek ran unmistakably through Callahan land. It had always run through Callahan land. The diversion claim Greer had filed was not just fraudulent, it was demonstrably, visibly, inarguably fraudulent to anyone who looked at the original survey with their own eyes. She made her notes on the request form. She returned the map to its drawer. She thanked Patterson on her way out, and he said, "You're welcome," without looking up, and she walked out into the Cheyenne street and climbed onto the wagon seat beside Dex and said, "Drive." He drove. When they were 2 blocks from the records office, he said, "Well, we have everything," she said. Dex exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the closest thing to an expression of profound relief she had ever seen from him. "Good," he said. "That's good." She pressed her notes flat on her knee and looked out at the street and felt the clean, specific satisfaction of a completed thing. Not victory yet, but complete. The lawyer's name was Harold Birch, and he was a compact, precise man who had been practicing law in Cheyenne for 20 years and had the particular quality of stillness that came from spending decades in rooms where the wrong word cost people everything. He received the complete documentation on a Friday afternoon. All 11 confirmed alterations, the 3 probable ones with their supporting evidence. The original survey map information, the affidavits from Martha Wren and Caroline Pell, and Abigail's master timeline, which he read without speaking for 40 minutes, while Wyatt sat across from him and Abigail sat beside Wyatt, and neither of them made unnecessary noise. When Birch finished, he set the papers down and looked at Abigail directly. "You compiled this?" "Yes," she said. "Over how many days?" 23. He looked at the timeline on the wall of his office where she had pinned a copy. "This is the most organized fraud documentation I have received in 2 decades of practice," he said. "Whoever taught you records work did an exceptional job." "I taught myself," she said. Birch looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to Wyatt. "We file Monday. I want to go before Judge Kane before Greer can get Harding. That's his usual attorney into position. Kane is methodical, and he respects documentation. This documentation will impress him." He paused. "I would like Miss Turner present at the filing, and available to testify if the case goes to full hearing." Wyatt looked at Abigail. She looked at Birch. "I'll be there," she said. The filing happened on Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Silas Greer knew about it, and by Tuesday morning, his attorney Harding had filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the counter-documentation was based on illegally accessed county records. It was a thin motion, and everyone in the room knew it was thin, but it was a delay tactic, and delay was Greer's most reliable tool. Judge Kane denied the motion on Wednesday in 4 sentences, the last of which was in Harold Birch's words when he told them about as pointed a judicial rebuke as he had seen from Kane in 15 years. Greer's second move came Friday. It was not legal. It was past midnight when Cody came running from the bunkhouse shouting that someone had cut the south fence, and 3 of the cattle were out on the road. And when Wyatt and Dex went to deal with the cattle, Abigail went to the desk and found that someone had been in the front room. Not ransacked carefully, searched the kind of search that tried to look like no search at all, but she knew exactly how she had left every document, and 2 of the copies were not where she had put them. She stood in the front room in the dark and breathed and thought, and then she went to the kitchen and she made coffee, and she waited for Wyatt to come back. When he came in muddy from the fence and controlled with the specific fury of a man who had been patient for as long as patience was going to serve him, she told him what she had found. He stood in the kitchen and listened, and his jaw was tight and his eyes were very dark, and when she finished he said, "The copies." "Copies of the secondary affidavits?" she said. "The originals are with Birch. Whatever they took doesn't change the case." "They were in my house," he said. "I know. They came into my house." The quiet in his voice was the kind of quiet that was not the absence of anger, but its deepest form, and Abigail looked at him and understood that Silas Greer had just made the specific mistake of going too far with a man who had been containing himself for weeks, because the legal process required it. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her. "Let Birch handle this," she said. "Tell him in the morning what happened, and let him put it in front of Kane. A man who loses a legal motion and then sends someone to search opposing counsel's client's home the same week, that is not a man who is winning. That is a man who is panicking." She kept her voice even. "Let him panic. It helps us." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around them, the whole ranch quiet, the Wyoming night outside doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and ongoing. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. "Go to bed. I'll lock the desk." He didn't move right away. He stood in the kitchen and looked at her with the expression she had given up categorizing, and this time he said, "Abigail." Just her name. The way he said it had changed somewhere in the past 3 weeks. She had noticed. She had filed it away in the part of herself that she was not examining yet. "I'm aware of it," she said quietly. "I'm also aware that we have a case to finish and a judge to stand in front of, and I would like very much to get through that before anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. "Thank you," she said. He went. She locked the desk and checked every window and sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace and let herself feel just for a few minutes the full weight of what she was carrying and what she wanted and how frightened she was, not of Greer, not of the case, but of wanting something this much and not yet knowing whether she had earned the right to have it. Then she put it away and went to bed because tomorrow was a workday. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Greer made 2 more moves, a letter to Abigail's mother in Kansas that was designed to frighten and succeeded only in making her mother write back to Abigail with the information that Clara had written from Colorado, that she was well and working in a dressmaker's shop, and was sorry and hoped Abigail could forgive her. Abigail read that letter at the kitchen table and felt the complicated layered feeling of loving someone who had hurt you, and being glad they were all right, and knowing that forgiveness was a thing you gave for your own sake and not theirs, and she wrote back to her mother and told her Clara was forgiven, and that things in Wyoming were going well. Greer's second move was a witness, a man named Cole, who claimed to have been present when Dex Halley discussed the land records irregularities before Abigail arrived, an attempt to suggest the whole documentation effort was manufactured rather than discovered. Harold Birch put Cole on the stand in the preliminary hearing and took him apart in 11 minutes, and Judge Kane's expression during those 11 minutes was reported by 3 separate witnesses to have been the look of a man who had heard enough. The formal judgment came on a Tuesday in October, 41 days after Abigail Turner had sat down at Wyatt Callahan's desk with a box of land documents and started following a number that didn't add up. Judge Kane ruled in favor of the Callahan Ranch, the Wren estate, and Caroline Pell on all primary counts. The deed alteration on parcel 14C was declared fraudulent and the original ownership restored. The water diversion claim was voided. Patterson resigned from the county clerk's office the same afternoon before a separate inquiry could formally open. Silas Greer faced civil penalties and a separate criminal referral that Harold Birch said would likely take another year to resolve. But the land was safe, and the records were corrected, and the 3 ranches that had been the target of a patient, methodical, years-long campaign of fraud were whole again. Martha Wren cried in the courthouse hallway. Not quietly, not with the controlled grief she had carried for a year and a half. She cried the way a woman cried when she finally put down something too heavy. When the thing she had been told was her husband's failure turned out to be a crime committed against him. When the weight of misplaced shame lifted all at once without warning. Carolyn Pell held her hand, and Esther Boone stood at Martha's other side with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and was not going to miss a second of it. Abigail stood a little apart and let them have it. It was their moment first. She had only been here 41 days. Wyatt found her in the courthouse hallway 20 minutes later. The others had gone outside. It was just the 2 of them in the quiet stone corridor, the sound of the street muffled and distant. He stood in front of her and he said, "Your month was up 2 weeks ago." "I know," she said. "You stayed." "There was work to finish," she said. "The work is finished," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hallway was very still. "It is," she said. "So," he said, and then he stopped because Wyatt Callahan was not a man who had easy access to the words for the things that mattered most to him, and she had known that about him since the 4th day, and she had always thought it was not a flaw, but a form of honesty, the refusal to say things he wasn't sure of, the willingness to stand in the silence until he was. "I came here to make something right," she said. "I told myself that every day for 6 weeks. I told myself that was the only reason I stayed." "Was it?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. 41 days. The desk in the front room, and the lamp burning late, and the coffee that was always made when she made it, and the way he had stood in the flood at midnight and said, "Come on." And they had both turned back to the work without needing to say anything else. The expression she had stopped trying to categorize because categorizing it would have required admitting what it was. "No," she said. He reached out and he took her hand, the one with the heeled rope burns still faintly marked, and he held it carefully, the way you held something you were not going to let go of. "I don't want you to leave," he said. Not a question, not a condition. Just the plain truth of it, said in the direct, unadorned way of a man who had finally found the right words and intended to use them. "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not because of what you did, not because of the case or the work or what you found in those documents. Because of you. Because of who you are when you're standing in my kitchen at 5 in the morning, and when you're waist deep in a flooded ditch at midnight, and when you're telling Silas Greer to his face in my yard exactly what kind of man he is." He looked at her. "I want you to stay because you are the most capable, the most honest, and the most completely yourself person I have ever had on this ranch. And I don't want to know what this place looks like without you in it." Abigail Turner stood in the courthouse hallway in Cheyenne, Wyoming, on a Tuesday in October, with the hand of a man she had not planned to fall in love with holding hers. And she thought about the morning she had put on her sister's torn dress and picked up a carpet bag and walked toward a stagecoach that was going somewhere she had never been to face something she had never done because someone had to, and because it was right, and because standing still had never once been who she was. She thought about Helen Marsh on the stagecoach asking, "Does it always go wrong?" and saying it doesn't always. She thought about her father's folding knife in her boot, and his hands pressing it into hers, and the way he had looked at her when he did it, not like someone leaving something to a capable daughter, but like someone recognizing a capable person who happened to be his daughter. She thought about the list she had made that first morning at the desk, and how she had written one right thing at a time, at the top of it, like a kind of prayer. "Yes," she said, "just that, just the one word." But Wyatt understood everything in it the way he had always understood the things she said plainly, and he closed his hand more firmly around hers, and that was that. They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Esther Boone standing up for Abigail and Dex Halley standing up for Wyatt, and Martha Wren brought a cake and Caroline Pell brought flowers, and Cody cried and claimed afterward that he had not. The day was cold and bright, the way Wyoming October days were cold and bright, and Abigail wore her own dress. Not her sister's, not borrowed, not pinned together in a hurry, a dark green wool she had made herself in the 3 weeks before the wedding, and she stood next to Wyatt Callahan in front of a traveling minister, and she said the words she meant with every one of them. The years that followed were not easy years. No years on the frontier were easy. But they were true years built on the same foundation as everything else: the daily work, the plain honesty, the willingness to look at what was hard and stay anyway. The railroad depot came through on the eastern ridge 2 years after the judgment, and the Callahan land was worth exactly what Esther had predicted it would be worth. And Wyatt used a portion of that money to help Martha Wren's son reestablish the family homestead, and a portion to fund the county school that Abigail had been corresponding with the Territorial Education Board about since her 2nd month in Wyoming. Their daughter Esther named for the woman who had looked at Abigail in a doorway on her 6th day and decided there was something real. There was born the spring of their 2nd year, and she came into the world the same way her mother had come into Wyoming, unexpected early and entirely ready for whatever was in front of her. Abigail kept the ledger. She kept all the ledgers. She kept the master timeline from the fraud case folded in the back of the deed box where it had always lived, because it was a record of something that had been made right, and she believed in keeping records of things made right just as carefully as you kept records of the wrongs. And sometimes in the evenings when the work was done, and the lamp was low, and the ranch was quiet around them, and Wyatt was sitting across from her with the account books, and their daughter was asleep in the next room, Abigail would look up from whatever she was writing and catch him watching her with that expression she had spent 6 weeks trying to categorize. She knew what it was now. She had known for a long time. She would look back down at her work and let herself feel it fully, the specific, uncomplicated, hard-won happiness of a woman who had walked toward the difficult thing, who had told the truth when lying would have been easier, who had stayed when leaving was permitted, and who had built something real with her own hands in a place she had not planned to be. She had come to Wyoming in her sister's torn dress, with a carpet bag and a folding knife and a habit of paying attention. She had not come to fall in love, or to save a ranch, or to become the kind of woman whose name people in the county said with a particular kind of respect. But she had done all of it anyway, the same way she had always done the things that needed doing steadily without fanfare, one right thing at a time. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. She was never the second choice. She was never the substitute, or the stand-in, or the woman who showed up because the right one didn't. She was exactly who she had always been, the one who stayed, the one who worked, the one who looked at a hard thing and did not look away. She was Abigail Turner Callahan, and she had carved every inch of this life with her own hands, and it was hers, and it was enough, and it was real.